I drove 7 hours with champagne and gifts. She opened the door and said, "This year's just for family." Then her husband texted the wrong person, me. I'm 32M. And on December 31st, I white-knuckled a 7-hour drive through a mountain blizzard with a bottle of imported champagne buckled into the passenger seat, like a VIP, and a trunk full of carefully wrapped gifts that crinkled whenever I hit black ice and fought the wheel. And the radio kept looping the same New Year's Eve countdown hosts who sounded weirdly cheerful for people who had never scraped a windshield at a gas station sink. And I told myself that this would be the year things softened between me and my sister. That this would be the year I stopped being the distant relative with the long drive and the short phone calls and became family again. Really family. The kind where you don't think about who pays for what until the dishes are done and the lights are off and the dog is snoring under somebody's chair. Claire had texted that morning, a chirpy confirmation paired with the exact champagne brand she wanted, and it landed like an order wrapped in a smile. And I decided not to overthink it, because sometimes choosing not to overthink is the only way you can keep driving when the snow turns the sky into a white sheet and the lane markers vanish and you can't tell if your headlights are useful or just decorative. And I rehearsed the hello in my head, and even the joke about the champagne being more expensive than my winter tires. And as the GPS cheerfully announced my arrival, I turned into their heated driveway and passed the gleam of Jason's new SUV, sitting there like a trophy under the garage light. And suddenly their house felt taller than it used to, taller than memory, taller than me. And I thought about my rent-controlled apartment where the heat thumps like an old heart and the windows sweat when I boil pasta. And I balanced 3 light gifts and the champagne and told myself the heavier things could wait until after the first hug, after the first laugh, after the first, "I'm glad you made it," which is a dangerous thing to tell yourself if you're wrong about the hug and the laugh and the gladness. Claire opened the door fast, like she'd been watching the driveway, and wanted to control the moment of my entrance, and she looked immaculate in the way that takes time and help. Makeup precise, hair like a magazine cover, and she smiled in a way I recognized from childhood. The smile before a correction. "Oh, honey, you actually drove," she said, with the exact pitch you'd use for a child's art project. And then she tilted her head, held the pose like a model hitting her mark, and gave me the line I will probably remember until the day I forget my own name. "This year's just for family." It's a simple sentence until you realize what it means when you're the person on the doorstep holding a bottle that costs more than your winter coat and gifts you wrapped to match the color scheme. She posted on social media, and I waited for the laugh that means she's kidding. I waited for the wink that means you got me. I waited for the correction that means you misunderstood the sentence, but the correction didn't come, only the silence did. And I stared at a version of my sister I used to know and realized that the old version had moved out a long time ago without leaving a forwarding address. And I did the bravest thing I've ever done and the quietest. I turned around. I walked back through the clean, expensive air of their neighborhood where the snowplows come on a schedule, and I put the champagne on the passenger seat with more force than I meant to, and the bottle rolled onto the floor like it was trying to escape. And I drove away into weather that felt honest. 15 minutes later at a red light in a small town, the stoplight blinked like an eyelid, and my phone buzzed with a text. And I let myself imagine it was Claire saying, "Come back." I messed up. I panicked. The house is loud, and I wanted control, and I said the wrong thing. And the universe could still be fixed, but the universe did not get the memo. And I saw Jason's name and the message previewed as if the phone wanted to protect me and failed. Why would that loser even show up? And a lineup of laughing emojis, a carnival of contempt, plus some live commentary about my car and my life. And he had meant to send it to a group chat about me, which is a phrase that should never exist. And instead he sent it to me. And I felt something inside me lock into place, an old door that finally found its latch. And I pulled off at the first gas station and parked under a buzzing light that made everything look like a memory amplified. And the snow came down in quiet flakes, and it was like the world had muted itself so I could hear what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that for 5 years since our parents died, I had been the quiet financial scaffolding behind their house, and their phones, and sometimes their groceries, and that my name was on policies they liked to pretend were magic, and my fingers had typed passwords they liked to treat like weather, and the math of love had slowly become the math of keeping them afloat. And I had told myself that grief and transition come with invoices, and that's just life, and I had not noticed how easily they had come to expect it without saying the words "thank you" or "we'll take it from here." And I opened the insurance app and removed a vehicle that wasn't mine from a policy that was, and I watched the confirmation email land like a little clean bell. And then I opened the phone carrier app and stared at the family plan and the extra lines and the premium features I didn't use, and I untied the knot as carefully as I had tied it. And another confirmation bell rang, and then autopays and subscriptions and meal deliveries and cloud storage and the home security with the glossy ads and all the invisible convenience that had quietly routed through me got rerouted back to them. And I sat there and added the numbers like a clerk in a novel and realized that the total was the price of my life being smaller than it needed to be. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the sensation of my own spine. I drove again when my hands stopped shaking, and I stopped at a diner where the lights were warm in a way no chandelier can imitate, and a server named Maya asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes, and she refilled it twice before I asked, which is the kind of kindness that costs time and earns loyalty. And she said, "You driving through all this?" With the tone people use when they're not judging your choices, but are concerned about your safety. And I said, "Change of plans." And she said, "Then start with dessert." And I did because a stranger suggested it. Kindly. I went home after that to my small apartment that fit me and the life I could pay for without resentment, and I put my phone face down, and it buzzed and buzzed like a trapped insect, and I let it tire itself out because the emergency was not mine anymore. And I watched a movie I'd seen before for the comfort of knowing what happens next. And at 11:37 p.m., the first missed call from Claire arrived, and then they stacked up like flimsy chairs until there were 68 of them by morning, and it was like the world trying to break down a door that didn't exist. And on January 1st, I brewed coffee and made breakfast and read the message Claire finally sent. "We need to talk." And I replied with a sentence that fit in my mouth and didn't make me flinch. I said that family, by her definition, was just for family, and that I was going to spend my money and my time on people who wanted me, not my wallet. And then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and wrote down the word boundaries on a sticky note and put it on my bathroom mirror like a new rule of gravity. The first 3 days of January felt like stepping out of a pool I didn't know I'd been treading in, the kind where your arms are too tired to notice they're tired until they stop. And I opened a new savings account with the kind of quiet ceremony you reserve for planting trees. And I went for morning runs that were more honest shuffles than runs, but the rhythm of my feet on frozen sidewalk made a metronome out of the cold. And I researched cars I could afford that wouldn't be punchlines in someone else's text thread and apartments with windows that faced light instead of a brick wall. And I calculated how long it would take to have an emergency fund that deserved the name. And on January 3rd, Claire showed up at my place unannounced because apologies that require planning also require sincerity, and she was low on both. I saw her from the window sitting in the idling car. The makeup 2 shades too heavy for morning, the coat that said she had dressed for an outcome she believed in. And she knocked softly first like we were in a library, and then harder like we were in a movie. And when I opened the door, she looked past me automatically, inventorying what I own the way you do when you are assessing leverage. And I moved aside and let her in because I wanted to hear what story she would tell when the old story stopped working. She started with, "I was overwhelmed hosting," and slid into, "It was a stupid joke," and parked in, "You're being too sensitive." And I let her do the full loop because interrupting a performance only encourages improvisation. And when she paused for applause that wasn't coming, I asked the question I'd carried since the doorstep. If it was a joke, who was supposed to laugh? Because I don't know what comedian opens with, "This year's just for family," to a brother who drove 7 hours through a storm. And she pivoted to a new script about private family drama. She was protecting me from, which is the kind of phrase you deploy when the facts are not on your side. And then I asked about the text from Jason, and she said he had been drinking, as if alcohol were a ventriloquist, and he the puppet. And I said that drunk words are sober thoughts with the volume turned up, and she stared at me like I had used a language she didn't speak. She didn't mention money, which was interesting. The way a missing painting is interesting because you can see the outline where it hung, and she changed tactics and asked what it would take to move past this and start fresh and get back to normal. And I told her that we had in fact started fresh, and that the new normal was the one where I didn't pay for her life. And you can tell when a sentence hits because the face across from you tries not to show the math it's doing. And she asked if I was really going to punish her for a misunderstanding, and I told her it wasn't punishment, it was reallocation, a word that belongs to budgets, but also works fine for love. And I said that if I wasn't family enough to step across her threshold holding the champagne she requested, I wasn't family enough to be a line item in her monthly plan. She cycled through the greatest hits: guilt, anger, nostalgia, future promises with no dates. And I answered each one with a short sentence because long ones are where loopholes hide. And eventually she left because the door that would open wasn't mine. It was inside her, and she didn't have the key yet. A week later, I got a call from Margaret, Jason's mother, who has the kind of voice that's built for asking hard questions without making anyone defensive. And she said Claire had asked their side of the family for help because of unexpected bills, and Margaret wanted to know if there was a storm she should prepare for. And I told her the version of the truth that fit into respect, that boundaries around money had been clarified, and that adults were now paying for what adults used. And Margaret sighed the sigh of women who have managed men's messes for decades and thanked me for my time and did not pressure me, because mature people know that pressure distorts more than it persuades. Around the same time, my inbox became a parade of messages from mutual acquaintances, all variations on, "I heard there was a misunderstanding," and "Could we all sit down together?" And I ignored most of them because narratives are hydrous, and if you feed them, they grow more heads. But I met Nora for coffee because she has known our family long enough to remember when my mother could fix a mood with a casserole and a look. And I told Nora the short version that still took a long time, including the accidental text and the years of quiet financial help. And she covered her mouth with her hand like she was trying to keep a laugh from escaping, but it was shock. And she offered to mediate out of reflex. And I said no, because you cannot mediate geometry into changing. Lines are either parallel or they intersect, and this one wasn't going to. In late January, I saw Meyer again because I had started stopping by the diner after morning runs, partially for the coffee and partially for the way she said my name like it wasn't a problem to solve. And she asked how the new year was treating me, and I told her that sometimes freedom is a room with your own bills on the counter, and she said, "That'll be $12.95. And we both laughed because jokes and truth share a table more often than we admit. February arrived wearing gray like a uniform, and one evening my phone lit up with Jason's name, and I let it go to voicemail. But then I listened because curiosity is a poor locksmith, but it still jiggles the handle. And he sounded like a man calling from the bottom of a well. Echoey, humble, careful, apologizing for the text and for what he called a dumb moment that doesn't represent who I am. And then he slid into the ask, which was if there was any chance I could turn back on just one or two things, maybe the phone plan or the car insurance, until we get through this. And he promised there would be gratitude, public even, and inclusion, meaningful inclusion. And I called him back because I wanted to move this from voicemail to daylight. And I thanked him for the apology and told him that the accidental text had simply confirmed the tone I had sensed for years. And I asked him a question that sounded small and was not. How long have the jokes been going on? And the silence that followed was the first true thing he gave me. And when he found words, he called them occasional comments that were affectionate, which is what people say when they want to varnish a chair that's already broken. And I told him I hoped they would find a way through their finances and that I would not be part of that solution because I had finally learned the difference between an ATM and a brother. And he said he understood in the tone of a man who did not. And when we hung up, I felt a quiet click, the second in 2 months. In late February, an envelope arrived with my name in Claire's handwriting, which has always looked like she expected the paper to obey her. And inside were 3 pages that read like a reconciliation speech co-written by nostalgia and fear. Childhood memories bullet-pointed for effect. Admissions of terrible mistakes. Promises of future holidays where everyone listens and nobody raises their voice. And while some sentences rang with genuine regret, the melody underneath was a request for me to reconsider the money because the car note was a wolf at the door and the utilities had started leaving voicemails with a different tone. And I read it twice because I am not a monster and because grief is still a character in our story. And then I put it in a folder with other important papers because not responding can be a kind of response when the person you love most is the person you're learning how not to save. March didn't so much arrive as unspool, and I signed a lease on a larger apartment with windows that remembered light. And I bought a car that started even when the temperature tried to be clever. And I sat with a banker who explained interest rates with a pen he clearly liked and opened a high-yield account for an emergency fund, which is less glamorous than a vacation and more like oxygen than it sounds. And on a Saturday, I drove to a city I didn't know yet and bought myself dinner at a place with a wine list printed on real paper and watched a movie in a theater where the sound makes your ribs vibrate. And I felt something like sadness and something like pride, and I realized the two can share a table without arguing. In April, I ran into Nora at the farmer's market, and she said that Claire had started telling a version of the story where I had pulled the rug out from under them without warning. And I said that people under rugs rarely notice who's been vacuuming. And Nora laughed hard, and then said softly that she was proud of me, and I took the compliment like medicine, not candy. In May, I told Maya about the new place, and she said bring by a photo, and I did. And she said the couch looked comfortable in the morally correct way, and I told her that I had a plant still alive after 4 weeks, and she high-fived me like we had won a small championship. And the regulars at the counter argued about baseball and politics in the way that means no one is actually angry. And for the first time in years, a public room felt like a living room I was allowed to sit in without performing. Summer came without incident, which is my new favorite way for seasons to arrive. And I learned that if you stop marking your calendar with crises, your days start to fill themselves in with smaller, kinder things: a friend's backyard, a library hold text, a Saturday spent changing the oil on a car that will not betray you for a joke. And I took a long weekend to drive to a national park I had only seen on other people's screens and stood at a lookout where tourists whisper without knowing why. And I thought about my parents and the way my mother would have pressed her hand into my chest like she was checking for a fever when something upset me. And I said out loud that I missed them, which made a hiker glance over like he had overheard a prayer. In September, a mutual friend told me that Claire and Jason had sold the SUV and downsized their place, and that they were figuring it out. And I nodded because adults can do hard things when the thermostat of their life is set to reality. And I did not feel triumph, only a quiet relief that the story might turn into two parallel lines that run separately but cleanly. In October, months after my last reply, Claire sent a photo of a handwritten budget on a yellow pad, a sentence beneath it that read, "I'm learning," and I stared at it for a long minute, and then put the phone face down and went for a run, because forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's a dimmer that you adjust when your hands are steady, and my hands were not steady that morning. Winter returned as it does, and on a day when the sky was the same color as the street Maya spotted me through the diner window and waved me in and poured coffee before I sat. And we talked about nothing in that luxurious way that means everything is finally not on fire. And she said, "You look different." And I said, "I think I do." And she said, "Good different." And I said, "Thank you." Because sometimes the bravest sentence is the shortest. If you need the formal ending, it's this: I have not spoken to my sister since late winter, except for the occasional administrative text about estate paperwork that still wanders across our family's landscape like a lost dog. I do not expect a holiday invitation, and I do not expect to send a bottle of champagne anywhere except my own table. And when I think about the night on the doorstep, I try not to replay it like evidence, and instead like a scene where a character learns the thing the audience already knew, which is that being needed is not the same as being loved, and being valuable to someone is not the same as being valued by them. And the difference between those two sentences is where my life currently lives. I have learned that boundaries are not fences to keep people out, but floor joists that keep you standing. That money is not love, but the misuse of it can feel like betrayal. That silence is a message, and sometimes it's a mercy. And on a morning in early spring when the good sun returns, I plan to sit in the park with a thermos and a book and let the city happen around me. And if I see Maya on a run, I hope she waves. And if she doesn't, that will be fine too, because the point of this story is not that the world rearranged itself to suit me, but that I finally rearranged my life to suit what I know to be true. And if you are reading this because you think you might be the scaffolding for someone else's house and they forgot to invite you inside, consider this both a warning and an invitation. You are allowed to step down. The house will creak and complain, and maybe a few fixtures will fall, but the ground under your own feet will stop moving. And there is a kind of peace only available to people who stop apologizing for choosing themselves.